Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. I want to remind all of us that we're right now in the middle of our Women and Writing series. And today we're going to be speaking with Shayna Goldberg about writing modern wisdom literature. Shayna, I hope it's okay with you that I gave it that name.
Sure.
Shayna Goldberg teaches in Migdal Oz. She's a yoetzet halacha and a contributing editor for Dracheha, womenandmitzvot.org. She is a frequent blogger for the Times of Israel and the author of the forthcoming book, What Do You Really Want? Trust and Fear in Decision-Making at Life's Crossroads and in Everyday Living. Shayna, it's really great to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I really like to start all these conversations in the same way. And while today our conversation is going to focus on your writing and the writing process, I wanted to hear a little bit about your journey into the world of Torah learning and how that started for you. You can take us as far back as you'd like.
Okay, sure. I think it's impossible for me to talk about my relationship with Torah without starting with my home. My parents, Rabbi Yaakov and Abi Lerner, they were the rabbi and rebbitzin of the Young Geshe of Great Neck for 45 years. And I was really privileged to grow up in a home where love of Torah was just part of our everyday life. So from an early age, Parsha with my mother, or before my bat mitzvah, we learned Sefer Chinuch, my father and I, from my 10th birthday and on. And it was natural. It wasn't something that was forced onto us. It was just part of the atmosphere, part of the avira of the home. And because of that, I think throughout high school, it was something that attracted me, that pulled me. And after my year in Israel and my year since during college, I was fortunate that just as I was finishing Stern, they announced that they were opening up GPATS, the Graduate Program in Advanced Talmudic Studies, part of Yeshiva University. And at a time where I wasn't sure where I was going to continue from there, it was the next obvious choice. And from there, after my 2 years of GPATs, I also spent time in the yoetzet halacha program, and really feel like the learning that began in my home became much more formal and much more intense, as I was able to do programs that were very text heavy, and also very much cared about the whole person and the relationship, not just, the learning Torah, but the relationships that we have with our teachers and with our peers in those programs very much built me in terms of my connection to Torah.
I have to say, I always have like an internal, not just also external, but smile when people speak about their home having been like a really beautiful start for them. And I think that especially for women who, for sometimes our journeys in the Torah learning world are very, very diverse because the path is not always so clear. It's a really special thing when people say that, yeah, really in my home, that's where I got all these, the foundations. So
very much so.
That's really beautiful. What do you love in particular about Torah learning? If we could, sort of an ode to Torah. I'm curious. I'll say that for me, I love the challenge, and I also love the yigia, because I have like I love the toil. I have a real love for working hard, which doesn't always mean that I choose things that are easy. But so I'm just curious, what's something that you love about it?
I very much relate to that. I would say the yigia for me, part of what was, I guess, has always been so meaningful, but especially I felt this when I was in GPATs, was this overwhelming sense of the vastness of Torah and the humility that inspired. I think, thank God, school came easy for me in high school, and when I started GPATs and I was thrown into this sea of Torah and learning Gemara B'Yun and realizing, wow, Gadol Alai, like there's so much here and there's so much to know, and what I know is just a cheap little small drop in the sea of Torah, that's something that I've carried with me. I think also the ability to be a player in terms of like an insider on the fields. I think about this a lot because my husband's a doctor, and there's a medical jargon that even if you know English, you can't really speak it. Like when we're with other doctors, it's like, hi, we're not understanding what you're talking about. Or the New England Journal of Medicine will come to the house, and there's articles there called Perspectives that I could identify with, and there's others that you really can't understand. And I feel like there's something about same thing. There's a safa of Torah that when you've learned it, even if you're not holding in everything there is to know, but just being able to pick up a sefer and be part of that, let's call it game, be on that field in our tradition, has also been something that has been very, I guess, inspiring to me, and something that I try to pass on to my students, just the ability to read text and be engaged with text so that you could talk about the issues that are burning for us even today in 2021 with a perspective of where it came from. And ultimately the connection that gives us to Hashem, feeling like we're speaking a language that when you try to get to know someone, oftentimes you do that by meeting them or reading things that they wrote. And at the end of the day, God's Torah is His word. That's what we believe. And I think the more that you are involved in it, the more that you learn it, the closer, hopefully, you feel to Hashem.
Yeah, I love that piece about the language also, about how every profession, my husband's a lawyer, right? Every profession has its own language. And when you're an insider, it gives you that flexibility and that ease. And you're not, I find also the intimidation factor. A lot of times people feel very excluded from Torah or don't have agency in their halachic life because they are not in it enough, meaning not placing blame on anybody, but without that, some sort of basic training, the language or the concepts feel very, very far. And so when you immerse yourself even to a small degree in Torah, it gives you an agency because you now have those tools in that language.
Right. It's so empowering to be able, when the student asks me a question and I say, you could go open up that sefer, and they realize, wow, I could open up and look it up for myself. Even if afterwards they want to have more of a conversation with someone or turn to a mentor, I think it's so, it opens up worlds to be able to speak that language.
Totally. Okay, I want us to get deep in your book, okay? When is it going to be released officially?
God willing, they're hoping for sometime in June. So we're, hoping that it's already available online in America, but the formal release and launch, God willing, will be as the academic year winds down, hopefully before the summer.
Okay, I'm just curious, before we even talk about the actual topic of your book, I'll admit, I've read your blogs in Time Israel and I really enjoy them a little. I won't say I stalk them, but I definitely click on them very quickly when they show up there. And I'm curious, when did your relationship with writing begin? What kind of form has that taken for you?
It's a great question. I don't know if I've ever been asked to think about when I started writing. And when I think about it, I guess I have to go back to in 11th grade. I became the op-ed editor of the Central newspaper.
That's a very important position. This is
I wrote all these, what I thought were the most passionate,
clearly
enlightened, intellectual pieces. And I had very strong opinions in high school about all kinds of things that were happening or not happening in the school. And it's funny because I hadn't looked at them in years. And then when my husband and I were dating, somehow it came up and I was like, oh, I'm gonna, go get the stack somewhere in my room. And we opened up the first one and I was horrified. I said, we have to put this away.
I wish that feeling would go away. I still have that about something I could have written last year. Yeah. It's like you're embarrassed.
I was so embarrassed. I guess, I think of it now because I have children in high school, and in high school you just think you know everything and you know what everyone else is doing wrong. So the microwave wasn't kosher and this, whatever, all the things that I wrote about. So I began, I think at that point, definitely being engaged with writing, but it wasn't something that I did formally. And then about 5.5 years ago, when things were very heated here in Israel and specifically in Gush Etzion, and there was a series of piguim beginning that Sukkot with the murder of Eitam and Nama Henkin, I just couldn't function. I really couldn't function. And I remember just sitting down at my computer and writing something up that I sent to my students and my family. And someone got a hold of it and they said, you should be publishing this for a broader audience. And it's not really my thing, and I'm not really the type to put myself out there. And they said, basically, after a lot of pressure, I agreed. And at that point, that was the first blog that I wrote for Times of Israel. And over that year, most of the pieces that I wrote were the spur of the moment, something's burning in me. I couldn't calm down until, I had never been like that, ever. But the writing was therapeutic. And when I would get something out on paper, I would be able to move forward. So even that year, I didn't post everything that I wrote. Some things I just sent to my family. Some things I posted. And then later on, I guess once that blog became some kind of vehicle of expression, I realized that there's also thoughts of mine, Torah thoughts or more developed thoughts that you could share in this medium, not just when I need to get something out because otherwise
there's an internal storm brewing.
Right. And since then, I guess that's 5 years ago, since then, I've been much more, focused on writing than I had been up until then. I never thought of myself as a writer. Kind of just happened and developed.
Wow. Okay. What did the process look like for you to actually write this book as a book form? How did that take shape?
Okay, so it's actually an interesting story because my husband and I for years have been discussing these ideas of trust and fear and decision making and education and parenting. And he would always kind of joke around with me and say, so Shayna, when are you going to write the book? When are you going to write the book? But again, I hadn't thought, this was before I was blogging, I hadn't thought of myself as a writer, and it was an ongoing joke. And then 8 years ago, when my daughter was born and I was on maternity leave, and I'm not so good at sitting still and relaxing, and I wasn't teaching my full role, my full load. So I said, you know what? I'm going to sit down and start writing up some of these ideas. So at that point, I actually began to write a little bit about parenting with trust, educating with trust, ideas of which I had been thinking about for a long time. And then I shelved it. When the maternity leave ended, I went back to my full-time teaching, kind of forgot about it. Wasn't something that was ongoing. And then about a year and a half ago, when she was already 7, so 7 years had gone by, I had a series of conversations, not with students, actually with peers, which was really interesting because a lot of the book, it was based on things that grew out of my teaching. But I actually had a series of conversations with peers who were struggling with different decisions. And when I said, I'll share with you something that sometimes I share with students. So the reaction of a few of them in a row were like, Shayna, you have to write this up. You need to do something with this. And at that point, I actually said, you know what? I did start writing something on this years ago. I took it out and I realized that what I'd writing about then, which was parenting and educating, I still wanted to address that, but that I wanted the heart of the book to really be about decision making. And then after that, take it into different specific areas such as parenting. So it was very much a process that spans years in a way and many, many conversations.
But that it took a shift when you realized that it was going to be interesting for a peer audience as well.
Yes.
You're saying that was the shift, meaning you're used to teaching and being instructive to younger students, but all of a sudden, a little bit like the blog, you realize, oh, this actually could be interesting for people that are also peers of mine and others out there in a book reading audience. So that was sort of like a moment.
A few of my, again, 2 friends specifically, they were in the midst of a tough decision and they found this to be helpful. And then a third friend of mine who I shared these ideas with, she mentioned to me that she had been talking to a friend who was struggling. And because of a conversation we had, she said she felt empowered to kind of be there for her and guide her. And that's when I realized, maybe there's a broader audience for ideas like this, not just my specific students, but maybe mentors, parents, even grandparents, people who are engaging, and not just for themselves, but even in terms of supporting others. So that was a real shift.
Okay, so take us through, again, we're all going to read the book and buy the book either way, but take us through in a few basic points about what is this idea of trust versus fear, and how does that play into decision making?
Let me start with saying how I started thinking about this, which was really, I guess, 2 things together. One was that I said, my husband and I have been discussing this for years, goes back to a quote that he had read many years back by Dr. Mordechai Breuer, who was talking about the educational philosophy of his grandfather, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and he said something like, in education, let us be guided by trust and not by fear. And Judah and I, my husband Judah and I, had spent a lot of time thinking about why are trust and fear opposites? Why is he presenting it like that? And then because of that, and because I was very attuned to that, in conversations with students, I began to notice that in my role specifically as a mashgicha ruchani in Migdal Oz, I began to pay attention that, first of all, the bulk of the conversations that students wanted to have surrounded one decision or another, sometimes major decisions, like next step in life, and sometimes simple decisions like, should I learn halacha or Gemara? Should I learn machshava or Tanakh? And when I would engage in conversation from a place where I very much did not want to be in a position to tell them what to do, even if I had a personal opinion, I do not want to take responsibility for other people's decisions. But more importantly than that, I'm a very, very big believer in autonomy and in agency and in empowering people to really believe in themselves. So I began to notice that if I just paid attention to what was being expressed from a place of fear, or what seemed to be what they really wanted, which is what I call trusting your instinct, your deep intuition about what you really want, that oftentimes that would allow me to give them insight into what I was hearing. Meaning when I was younger and I would sit down with a student and I'd kind of be nervous of what am I supposed to do and what am I supposed to say and what's my role in all this? What are they looking for from me? Over time, I began to have a much clearer picture of my place in the process and how I could support them to understand what they were really looking for. And that's really what the book talks about. The book is about how to be attentive to our inner wants, how to know what's something that's really pulling at us, how to identify different fears that may be getting in the way. In the book, I try to label some common fears that seem to stop people from doing what they really want.
Like what other people are going to think of you and... Right?
Yeah, what other people are going to think of you, sometimes our own self-perception. Mm-hmm. How could it be that someone who's as intellectual and as driven as me could date someone who's a second grade teacher? Not that there's anything wrong with being a second grade teacher, but meaning somebody's self-perception. Or how could someone like me go to X school? So there's that. Is this normal? So often we're afraid of, am I normal? Is this normal? Sometimes it's fear of failure, the classic one, or rejection. Sometimes it's just that we don't want to admit that maybe we've wasted time on something, or there's resources that we've invested, or now we're going to have to change course. So
that's I'll say personally, that's a huge one for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, mamash.
I mean, that one was really driven home by when I speak to students, or there's people close to in my life that their entire childhood or adolescence, they thought they were headed towards one career and they really, really invested in it, right? Take somebody who thinks they're going to be a lawyer and they spent summers interning and they study for hours for the LSATs and even going back to high school, mock trial, debate. And then here they are in law school and they're not enjoying it. What do they do at that point? So if they know that they're not happy and they want something else, sometimes what stops them is, but how could it be that I wasted all this time? And they end up, right? Or even on the very small level, I give an example of the book of this has happened to my husband and I, where we go out, we get a babysitter, we pay for a movie, and then you're sitting in the movie and you're just really not enjoying it. And you want to leave, but you're also feeling like, but we paid.
We finally left the house.
Paid. And my husband is the one who years ago said to me, the money's gone. Like, we paid for it. If we're not happy, let's get out of here. Totally. And that was really a mindset shift for me that, right, you're right. We don't have to stay here just because we paid for these tickets if we're not enjoying it. So there's on the small level and there's on the big level, but there's certainly a lot of fears that stop us from doing what we want.
Before you go any further, because I want to talk also about another concept that I thought was very insightful in the book, I want to just take a moment to think about where we are in this moment of time, because you mentioned that, when you first became a teacher, it was almost clear to you that there was like a top-down concept that like, I'm the teacher, so I know, and they're coming to me for advice. And maybe that's also how I'm going to put you and I in the same age group, right? Whatever number of years between us, because we would go to people and get advice, and we expected for them to guide us and send us somewhere good, right? But the world, again, the extreme expression of it is the selfie, right? But the world has shifted into a different space. I would say even in those years when we were somewhat younger, but maybe it took time for it to get to us in the circles we were in. But it's become really inappropriate, right? For someone else to come and say, you should do this, right? Meaning, this is what I think is best for you.
Not that stops people, unfortunately.
Not that it stops people. And I'll also say that I'm also very aware that if I'm speaking right now just within the Orthodox world, I'm speaking about a specific group, because you still have plenty of people who are living in a more Rebbe-centered kind of world, and I recognize that still exists. But for those of us who aren't in that kind of religious dynamic, that it's going to be more rare, okay? And that you find, I also, even years ago, remember hearing that people say, when you go to the big post-scheme, right? I'm not speaking in the Haredi world. You go to the big post-scheme in the religious world that's not the Haredi world. And once in a while, if you asked a very specific question, they would tell you an answer to your question. But when people would go and ask about a particular topic, often they would come back and be like, they didn't tell me what to do, right? Or they told me.
Was definitely known for that.
He was known for that.
And my father is a Talmud of his, and my husband was also a Talmud of his, and that approach certainly has influenced, my education and my upbringing. But I think even in, let's say, the Shana B'Aretz world, that I'm very much a part of. I wish I could say
which is the gap year,
the gap year world, the gap year world of yeshivot and midrashot. I wish I could say across the board that there's been a shift. But part of what has motivated me to write this book and to really get it out there on paper is because I think that it's something that we still struggle with, and I see educators struggling with it. I see students struggling with it. And at some point I kind of said, you know what? I'm not sure that people are people and they have their approach. And I'm not sure that we could convince educators to take a different approach, but we could certainly empower students to be aware of when they're being influenced, to trust themselves, or whether they are, being taught motivated even from a place of fear and sometimes guilt. And I think the more students
and shame,
are aware
by the way,
of that,
which is a word you didn't use in the book, but shame is a big one.
For sure. Yeah. And I think the more students are aware of that, if they say, wait, 1 second, something's not feeling right to me, so then we could tackle this issue maybe from the bottom up.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't really spend time in that, both the age bracket of the students and also of those learning frameworks as much. So I'm happy, first of all, that you clarified that for me. I've been in the world of adults, and I guess in the world of adults, you take autonomy for granted. And so that's an interesting point. I also want you to touch upon specifically the decision making. You have a concept also about the next best decision, which I really liked, by the way. Mm-hmm. I really like that idea. So could you just touch upon that also, what that concept means?
Sure. It's also funny that you called it the next best decision.
Is that not what it said in the book?
Well, that's what I always called it, the next best decision, meaning all you could do is make your next best decision. Yeah. When I gave it to a few friends to read, they thought, first they were confused because they thought I was saying the next best, like second best.
Oh,
so I can't tell you, we spent days thinking about I really liked the next best decision. And then one of my friend's husbands was like, just switch it to the best next decision after we had been. So in the book, it's actually called the best next decision, okay, even though I still think of it as the next best decision. So yes, I think that concept, it grew out of two things for me, really. One is in our own lives, in my husband and I, like in our life. There's so many points where we ourselves could not have predicted the way that things would have turned out. And early on in our marriage, somebody had said to us, my husband was in medical school. He went to medical school thinking that maybe he wouldn't even practice, a whole crazy story. And he was always nervous about how things would turn out. And at some point, someone gave him this amazing advice, which was just at any point where you need to make a decision, you will know at that point what's the right thing to do. So we put it into this phrase, the next best or the best next decision, but that ended up being our guiding principle, meaning when we should make aliyah or where we should live or what school our kids should go to. It was always like, what? At the time that we need to make that decision, we're going to have all the factors in front of us to be able to make the best decision that we can. If we try to think now about something that's not relevant immediately now, we could end up approaching it wrong because we don't have all the factors laid out in front of us. So very much in our own lives, we've lived that and experienced that and definitely benefited from it. And in addition, because I teach young women and I find myself very often in conversations with women who are dating and also sometimes men who are dating, very much in dating, I feel like that concept is very strong. This just happened even last week, talking to a woman who is dating for several months and she's not sure, and she'll say something like, I don't know, maybe I should break up. I said, sounded pretty happy. Like, why would you want to break up? And she'll say something like, because I don't know if this is going to work out. So if we're eventually going to break up, so maybe I should break up now because I want to save myself the heartbreak. And you stop and you say, wait, 1 second. You're going to break up now because but what if in a few months everything, is wonderful? All you could do is think about the decision that's right in front of you, which is, do you want to go out with him again? Do you want to get to know him better? Mm-hmm. Or are you ready to walk away? And I think that focuses people on the here and now and enables them. And I really believe if you keep making one good decision after another, then you get to where you're supposed to be, or at least you could own your decisions.
Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, just to throw in a few phrases, because when we try and predict the future, it creates a lot of anxiety for people, which is something that
absolutely
we all know as a world. There's a big plague of that in the world, and a lot of that's because people have been functioning for too many generations, even two, thinking that they can have control over what happens in front of them. And so we've had like a big backlash in the world, right? In all different ways, whether they come from the East or wherever they come from, that we say, let's take a step back. Let's see where we are now, right? There's this, I'll bring in a personal example from my family. So I live in Israel, but no one else lives here. Okay. And it reflects itself also in mindset and all different things that come up. And I have a brother who I love. Shout out to Joel. He'll never listen to this. So that he's all about the strategic thinking. Okay. Now, strategic thinking, the word comes up I turn to him plenty for advice. I respect him very much. And strategic thinking for him has worked well over time. But sometimes when you live in another part of the world where like things are a little bit less predictable in the long run or even in the short run, and strategic thinking is really important. And there also is a need to that now I'm confused what the phrase is, your best next decision. Okay. So
there you go.
And it's that approach has been one for me before having met you and seeing it written in the book is something that very much has spoken to us over time. And sometimes it can even come to pass that decision wasn't a great one. But if you know that when you made it, that you made it with all the facts in front of you and you made it willingly and knowledgeably, then you say, okay, that was another step on the journey, as opposed to, and again, I'll use a personal example. We lived somewhere else for the past 2 years and it didn't work out. We built the house there. We did the whole bit and it didn't work out. And there were some signs in the beginning that it probably wasn't necessarily going to be the best decision, but we made it then. We made it together and we went both willingly. And it turned out that it wasn't great. And we moved back and, to the Jerusalem area. And for those who think the long-term strategic, it was like, that was a big fat mistake, And we're like, no, it wasn't. Meaning it was not right for us, but we made it. It was another step in the journey. There was a lot that we learned from that decision. There was even a lot from the tremendous difficulties that it created for us, but it's not a mistake. And so when you break up the decision into parts, and it's not like this leads to the rest of my life, which I will say I have a tendency to think like that. And I'm thankful to be married to a man who doesn't. So it just makes everything much more.
I couldn't relate more.
Palatable.
That's exactly, I think, doesn't mean that every decision that you make is going to work out, But when you know that you made the best decision that you could in that moment, so then you could own it and you understand it, and you don't necessarily regret it because you know why you made it, but then you say, okay, we've reached the next crossroads, time for a new decision. Right? And it's not the same decision anymore because it's a new decision because now you're
totally
already
different.
living there
It's
and
totally
you're
different.
So now it's not should we live there and should we move there, but it's okay, should we stay here or should we go? And it's a new decision, but then you're able to make that the best that you can. So in terms of what you said about strategic planning, I think that that's part of the shikul, part of what you take into account, meaning I'm a big control person, and part of facing the best next decision is a little bit letting go of that long-term control, because I like to think that I could control everything, and then I've been reminded too many times that you can't. But at the same point, that doesn't mean that you don't take into account your bigger dreams, goals, aspirations. That factors into your best next decision the same way so many other things do.
Yeah, that idea comes up so much. Meaning, I often think it's been true for women for a very long time, but I think it's also become true for men as well, just because the work life has shifted. That for women, it's always been very clear that life happens in chapters, just because biologically our life happens in chapters. And so, while those of us who want the planning and who have bigger, broader goals, it sort of helps us gain perspective on like, okay, this is in the now, or this is these few years, but I know where the train ultimately I would like it to be heading. I think that as a world, for all different reasons and modernity and how the job force has shifted, that and people just don't stay in jobs for a very long time. That's the point I'm trying to get at. That no one stays in jobs for too long. And everybody says, I've never heard anybody in my peer group say to me, yes, I am now happy for the next 30 years. Meaning, it's not even anyone's goal anymore. Like, no one's goal is to be in that. That is like a shameful idea that I'm going to
Whereas most of my friends' parents, for sure, their dads, I mean, they entered into a job and they stayed in that firm or in that, for most of their lives. And it's just not what we see around us, which in some ways good. I think things are more dynamic, more fluid.
There's a healthy place, someplace in the middle. That we need continuity, and we also need to be open to shifting and growing. And we're generations at this point of people who are like very growth oriented in a way sometimes we don't realize. It's also part of the anxiety
that you mentioned, because you never know kind of if this is for real or if this is going to last. That stability, I guess, is missing.
And so we need that. Like, I'm sure like all things, trends, we bounce from one into the other and somehow we'll end up somewhere healthy in the middle. But like, there needs to be some sort of balance between the continuity and also being aware of our need for challenge and growth and shifting when we feel needed. Meaning, I think your book is even more poignant, just to also circle back to it, because you came to this place of meeting 18, 19-year-olds who are really just by nature at a very decision-making space in their life, or 20, 21, or whatever it is, that age bracket. But because the world shifts so much today, I feel that people are either being forced into decision-making places, or they are forcing themselves into decision-making places at such a more rapid pace than our parents' generations were. Meaning, they're in their job, they're happy. But I've been in it for 4 years. I have a friend, she's a nurse, and she's just needs the next challenge. It's just she needs to move forward already. And what that means is that there's a lot of shift in decision-making in a short amount of time.
What we're looking for, our expectations are different. What we're looking for out of a career, a lot of things have shifted. So very much contributes into that. And also as parents, I think things have shifted very much for our children. And therefore being able to recognize that is also a big part of this. Being able to guide them and, support them in being able to make the best next decisions, as opposed to being racked with anxiety that you spoke about earlier, is very, I think, crucial in the age that we're living in.
I also want to touch upon the point specifically about the trust idea. So first of all, I just want to read 2 lines in the book that I really liked. I apologize, I don't actually remember where it's from. It's somewhere in the beginning. While developing self-confidence has never been simple, the challenge has been magnified by an abundance of choice, an emphasis on pluralism, and current trends in parenting. the need to educate toward and encourage trust has never been greater. And I want to touch upon that point because you speak a lot about trust, which is a knowing, right? And these are words that I've put in them as I'm reading the book, so please correct me along the way, that very much what you encourage is that this is not a top-down approach, that you speak to a person, you're doing reflective listening, essentially, right? In Hebrew, we call it shikuf. You're doing reflective listening. And what you're trying to get from them is, where are you holding at this moment, right? Where is that? The decision is already somewhere inside of you, because ultimately we're swayed in some form. And so the person, you try and help them get to a place where they realize what it is that they want.
Right. That's why I called it, what do you really want? Because I feel like it always comes back to that, but this and this, and it's like, but what do you really want? And it's somewhere in there usually. They know. This,
I want to talk about this because it's really a skill. Okay. What you're describing. Some of us grew up in homes that gave us confidence to trust our inner sense or our intuition. I definitely came from a home like that. As long as there was some thought process behind what I was doing. Thankfully, also none of us ever wanted to do anything that was crazy. I don't know what my parents would have done if we had. Okay, right. But our intuitions led us into largely normative spaces. Okay, so but it was very much a home where that was emphasized. So, but many people are not. Okay, and this isn't about a bad home. It's simply about the whole culture in the home. Many people grow up in a home where there's an idea of right and wrong, and they are, through all different either overt or covert messaging, are taught that they don't necessarily know what's right for them inside. And so a lot of times it's a cultivated sense that people have to get to. It's not just a cognitive, if I think hard enough, I'll discover what it is that I like. But it's actually getting to know something deep inside you that you can connect with and be like, oh, I'll even give a very trivial example. Ordering food in a restaurant.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay. So I'll just give,
talking
about my family a lot today, by the way. So my sister never knew what to order in a restaurant. Okay. And I was like, sit down, 3 seconds later, I know what I want. I have to tell you, it was always a great dish. Like, meaning I knew what I wanted. I was like, had somehow, I figured it out, and it was very clear what I wanted. And it was a personality difference. We grew up in the same home, right? And also, and this happens, this annoys my husband sometimes, but he's like, well, it's Monday, so what should we make for Shabbos? And I'm like, it's too early. We need to talk about this on Wednesday. He does the food shopping, so he has the right to ask me on Monday. I said, I kind of need to feel it. Like, I need to feel and he's just like, what do you want to feel? And I'm like, no, I need to feel it. Like, I don't know. Like, do we want salmon? Do we want to have meat? I'm just not sure, So some of us have like a little bit more, and this doesn't necessarily make life easier, by the way, but some of us have a more like developed intuition in that regard. But then sometimes you'll meet people and they really don't. Like, they're not in touch with that. And there's a certain amount of work that they have to do.
Very much so.
To get in touch with that space.
Very much so. And way more than I care about teaching Torah or developing commitment to Judaism, all things I care deeply about. But much more important to me is that my students, my children, are healthy people who know how to. If you don't trust yourselves, what do you have? How do you function? Either you feel dependent on people, or you feel lost. You don't function well.
Yeah.
And for me, that has been, I guess, a cornerstone of my educational philosophy of empowering young people to trust themselves, to find that inner voice, to know that they have the best sense of themselves. Of course, you could talk to people, and sometimes there's even a therapy process that's needed, or somebody's really struggling with something. This book is no way meant to be in place of therapy, which we could talk about, but just empowering people that at the end of the day, you know yourself better than anyone else. And there's something in you. I hear you saying that you really want that, but I also hear you saying that you're afraid to pursue that. So let's discuss why you're afraid, and let's see if those fears are things that in the end should, register as reasons not to pursue what it is you really want. But let's at least be honest first that you do know what you want. It's deep in there. And the ability to hear that, to trust that, to run with it is something that is a skill that can be developed. I've seen at least in my teaching experience, young women who really struggled with this for all the reasons in those 2 lines that you just quoted, because of helicopter parenting today and everything was always solved for them. They didn't have to think so much, or because there's just an abundance of choice, or because, I had a class this week where we were discussing controversial topics and I asked them what their opinion is. It's a class that I call Opinions, and it's about empowering them to have an opinion. And a student, she said, well, I don't feel like I can have an opinion because I don't know enough, or it's not my right. And of course you could have an opinion. We live in an age where people are also been taught that they can't have an opinion because it might offend someone. It may, violate. That really has contributed to young people today. Wow. They're afraid to have a stand because, especially in the cancel culture that Americans are growing up in today, the sensitivity to saying anything that may offend someone in some way has very much impacted on their ability to say, hey, but I think that, or I feel differently. And obviously we have to do things sensitively and carefully and gently in general. But that doesn't mean you're not entitled to have thoughts about it.
I will also add that in terms of honing in that sense, that there are a number of really, really powerful ways that people can do that. And so I also just want to say, if anybody here is listening and that speaks to them at any age bracket that they want to work on that, that all of the physical practices that have come in from the East essentially work on that, whether it's yoga or all different kind of physical different ways of using our body. They actually heighten our ability to be in contact with those parts of ourselves. And so anyone who wants to reach out more, send an email. I'm happy to schmooze about that more. And I'll also say something that really came up for me when I was reading Shayna's book was the concept called focusing. And the concept of focusing was put into a practice by a philosopher named Eugene Gendlin. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. And he speaks about something called the felt sense. And he has a very simple book called Focusing, where there's a 6-step process where you need to do it with somebody else. You need to have a partner. But you work on being able to identify in yourself that sense you have, or that truth. It may not be, I have a question and here's my answer, but you might have to break it up into smaller parts, which we often have to when we come to these decisions, right? In this book, we're breaking it up into the fears we have. So in this kind of process, there are other parts that you break it up into, but it's a way of being able to read your intuition on your body. It's a fascinating thing. So anyone who's interested in that, could feel free to Google that and check it out.
Also, the trend today, there's so much talk about mindfulness. I think it's also connected to this. Yeah. Being able to really stop and be mindful of how you're feeling, and in so many ways, also in the physical way, right? What are you feeling right now? What are the sensations that are running through you? When you talk about that decision, do you feel your body reacting to it in a certain way? So there's a lot of elements, I think, of this that could be explored further. I'm
also just curious, when you were writing the book, were there any sort of other fields that you were checking into, or other literature that was enriching this theory that you were growing over the years? So I'm very honest and direct in the book about I'm not a therapist and I don't have any kind of degree in psychology or social work. Most of the book is really talking about everyday situations, and not situations, where someone's struggling with a deeper process that would really have to be addressed. So the book's not meant, again, to take the place of that. In writing the book, I did read, different books, different articles. I did have extensive conversations with different people in the psych fields. I had a very eye-opening conversation with Dr. David Pelkovitz about putting this into the context. He's the one that really focused me on the context of, he sees it in general in his practice and in Yeshiva University, how just adolescents, young adults are struggling so much more with decisions than they had in the past. So putting it into the context of the kinds of things that you spoke about a few minutes ago when you said that quote. And in general, I'm fortunate in my family to have psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists and a lot of people in the field to run these things by. So while I by no means am any kind of expert or any kind of professional, it was important to me that there's nothing in the book that is inappropriate
or is crossing a boundary that is not, not my place. That there were some examples even that I bring in the book that I changed or I honed a little bit to make sure that nobody would see this as some kind of replacement for deeper work that needs to be done.
Yeah, no, that you make that very clear in the book. I guess I want to ask one other question about the content per se. You do address it briefly in the book, but I'm curious to hear you speak about it here. When we speak about us knowing what we want, or what do you actually really want, or putting us at the center, which it's always been to a certain degree in the world, but obviously it's received much more emphasis and weight in the past years. I don't even know how to put a time on that. How does that fit into an Orthodox lifestyle, which is essentially, well, we do have autonomy, but it's very clearly limited in certain ways. So I'm curious how you think about that. Do you even think that they have any sort of contradiction between them? If we place so much emphasis on what it is that we really want at this moment, is there eventually a glass ceiling?
Okay, so let me be very honest about the fact that there's for sure people who have different feelings about this, than I do, different hashkafic approaches. And even my sister and I, who are very close, and I think begadol in general, we share a similar approach in terms of how we educate. We've been joking that we should, sell what do you really want along with show want, what does Hashem really want, and we'll sell them together. Because what if what you really want isn't what Hashem really wants? Now, I happen to believe very strongly, this is really at the core of who I am, that Hashem gave us bechira chofshit. Meaning, we could have been malachim, we could have been angels, we could have been robots. God created us with not just the ability, with the charge to make our own decisions. That's what he wants us to be doing here, and to be making the best decisions that we can, and to be making the world as good of a place as it could be. He gave us that. That's what makes us human. That's our job in life, to make good decisions. So I feel like that as a concept does not run contrary to orthodoxy or to halacha. Now, the truth is that most of the book talks about people who are deciding between good and good, right? Not between right and wrong. When it's right and wrong, or again, what is right and wrong? There's definitely some things that are wrong in terms of they're not halachic
decisions. That comes up a lot. It comes up a lot. And people are making, well, I just don't feel that this reflects who I really am. Okay, so what do you do with that?
Right. So when I'm talking to a student, I think, I'm very comfortable with the fact that they know who I am, they know what I believe, they know how I live my life. Talking to them and hearing what's on their mind, to me, is not invalidating the place that I put halacha, where I hold it or how important I think it is. At the end of the day, though, this young woman or young man or my child still has to figure out where they're going to go from here. So if they're saying, let's take an example of a young couple that's dating and they're struggling with shmirat negiyah. That's an issue that comes up a lot. So they're not looking for me to say whether it's mutar or asur for them to have a physical relationship before they're married. They know what the halacha says and they know what I think. But as they're struggling with this and I'm listening and they're weighing all different kinds of different factors, I could say to them, listen, you have to figure out what you really want. And what you really want is what you really want in a deeper sense, meaning I'm not talking about what you want in the moment, what you want, in that impulsive sense, or like something's pulling at me right now. I'm talking about what you want in a deeper sense. Now, sometimes what somebody wants is to be more committed, but they're struggling the same way I may want to get up and daven in the morning, but at that moment, I really wanted to stay in bed, right? But there's what I want and there's what I really want. And sometimes, no, what they really want is to do something that is contrary to halacha. And what I could say to them is, listen, you have to be honest about it. You know what the halacha is. You know what the different factors are that you're weighing. Are you ready to take responsibility for that? I always tell my students it's much harder for me when people are in denial, or like in the Shmat Negiah example, if they'll say like, oh, God doesn't really want this, or no, I really think that he's okay with what I'm doing, or it didn't mean that. Because then it's like, listen, I'm not sure you're ready to take responsibility for the decisions that you're making. But if you're telling me that you're struggling with this and this is the best that you could do right now, all any of us could do is the best that we could do right now. So then that means you're making the best decision that you can right now. Who knows how you'll feel next week? It leaves open. I talk a lot in the book about living with tensions. I mean, when we hear about tension, who wants to live with tension? I am a huge believer in living with tension, because if you live with tension, that means that you're holding on. Instead of saying, this relationship is important to me and halacha is not important to me, you're saying, wow, this relationship or this physical relationship is important to me and halacha is really important to me, and I'm in tension right now, but I'm not willing to just close the door on halacha. Right now, I'm making the best decision that I can, given all the things that I'm dealing with and all the struggles. But maybe my next decision will be something different, because the halacha is still here right now. And I think in the long run, that brings people closer to halacha and closer to orthodoxy and closer to their relationship with Hashem, because we know that life isn't black and white and it's not all or nothing. And I think when it's set up, like either you're halachic or you're not, or there's a right decision and there's a wrong decision.
It pushes people further away. It's kind of like disconnecting from a child, right? Instead of saying our relationship isn't in a good place right now, but I'm never closing the door on you.
Right.
And leaves open the possibility that they'll always walk back in.
So I could imagine that there are colleagues of mine, peers or educators who would feel uncomfortable with this, because they're like, how could you rubber stamp someone doing something that's not halachic? That's not how I view it. I don't think I'm rubber stamping. I think I'm very clear with the student. They know and I know. We all know what we're dealing with. But the idea that you could push someone to do something that they're not ready to take ownership and that it will turn out okay, even if on the surface it looks okay. Someone recently was telling me, but I believe it's the right thing to make aliyah. So I tell my students they have to make aliyah. And maybe there was a student that didn't want to, and now they did. And everything's sababa, and they're happy, and everything's working out. Like, you don't know the prices of that decision. You don't know if there's inner resentment. You don't know if something doesn't work out 20 years from now. They're struggling with one of their children here, and they say, if only I had listened to my gut and not done what I didn't want to do. I think that the gap between the way things look and the way things are is huge. And therefore, as an educator, I don't think that we ever come out ahead by pushing people. Even if in the short term you could pat yourself on the back and you could say, I pushed this kid to do the right thing. In the long term, I always tell my students, I'm in it for the long term. I'm not in it to at the end of their shana b'aretz, their gap year in Israel, or even 5 years. I could say, wow, look at these amazing students. I'm in it so that, 60, 70, 80 years from now, we see healthy individuals who feel empowered to make good decisions in their life.
Shayna, as we begin to wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask you, after having written this book and been through this process, what kind of books would you like to see women writing? I'm speaking obviously here about religious women writing books that are somewhat for the religious world, since that's the focus of our series. And I'm just curious where you think we could benefit from that, and how much we want to encourage the women listening.
I'd like to see women writing on everything, on Tanakh, on halacha, on Gemara, on machshava. And the reason is because the insight, the perspective, the feminine voice, what it brings to the conversation is always going to be something a little bit different than what the male voice brings, just because the nature of life. I'm very involved in this website, Drachaha, run by Lori Novick, where we're trying to bring the halacha, but add in the female perspective. And even that, I think, adds a lot to the conversation. So women should get out there and not be afraid to share their insights.
Amen. Okay, to close out this conversation, are you ready for a little lightning round?
Okay. Here we go.
Associative. No, you just throw it out there, okay? Shayna, what books are currently on your nightstand?
I wish I could read at night and not fall asleep after a line, but
Yes.
the psych books, I just read for the second time, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone.
Oh,
by
I
Laurie
love that.
Gottlieb.
I just mentioned that in our last episode.
Oh,
it's
really?
a great
I had
book.
to read it again, and I just
great
read
book.
The Choice. Viktor Frankl, he's mentioned in all those books. All the I guess this genre that encourages people to be in touch with themselves.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's a great book. If you could sit down with anyone for coffee or tea or whatever your beverage of choice is, who would it be?
It's a tough question. I would go with my grandmothers. One of my grandmothers I'm named after, my mother's mother, Jenny Dvoretsky. I never met her. And my father's mother, thank God, I did have a deep relationship with, but both of them had such resilience. Both had different challenges and faced a lot of hardship and faced it with courage and dignity and strength. And the older I get and the more challenges and raising kids, the more I wish that I could sit down and talk to them about it.
Yeah, I hear that. I think also as life gets more challenging, I keep wishing. No one's asked me this question. If I did, the more life has passed, I would say my father, who I very much miss. What is your favorite tefillah?
As a tefillah, like Kabbalat Shabbat, hands down, just wait for it every week, and so beautiful. But as a specific tefillah, I have to go with the yoetzet that we say at Halakat Nerut. Again, maybe parenting children as they're getting older, but when we say, v'zakenu legadel banim ubnei banim, the mix of words there, Ohavei Hashem and Yirei Elokim. I love that Ohavei Hashem comes first, that positive relationship. I love that Anshe Emet, people of truth, people of dignity, who are Me'irim et Holam, who are giving to the world, not just with their Torah, but with their Maasim Tovim. Very meaningful tefillah.
Yeah, we sing that, me and my girls, when we light candles on Friday night.
Beautiful.
Something unexpected that you feel passionate about, meaning other than the things that you've already said, you feel passionate about.
I mean, this is connected, but I've always felt very passionate about women's education. I'm also from an all-girls house. I'm the oldest of 4 girls. So women and women's education and Torah education. But now I have, thank God, 4 boys and a girl. And I've become very passionate about men's education, and specifically men's education about the world of women and about sensitivities and about kind of understanding what it's like to be an Orthodox woman, being sensitive to that. I love that my boys have their eyes open. Like we were in Sfad a few years ago and with Migdal Oz, and we were at Kabbalat Shabbat, and somebody clapped on the bima and shushed the women from singing. And my students handled it okay. My boys came home and they said, it's not okay. And I was just, that sensitivity has been something very important to me.
If I ever have boys, I hope to raise them like that. Any hidden talents?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
What you see is what you get. Okay. I'm an open book.
Your talents are out there. Something that you are grateful for in your life right now?
I have to say my parents made Aliyah this past summer in the midst of COVID. Couldn't have been a better time. And the fact that they're here, and my youngest sister, Safi, God willing, is coming this summer, and that will be it. My parents and the 4 of us all here in Israel is a dream that we never really actually thought would happen. Sometimes I think about the fact that years down the road, people are going to look back and say, oh yeah, there was this little blip for like 50, 60 years where the family was in America. I mean, we're so American, but the fact that, thank God, our family is now here in Israel is something that I just feel so grateful for. Every time I get in the car and go visit my parents in Katamon, I just can't believe that they're here, that I could visit them. Very grateful for that.
That's really unbelievable. Shayna, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really a pleasure to meet you and to speak with you about it. And I wish you a lot of hatzlacha, and I hope that this book reaches all of the people that it should.
Thank you, Yosefa. This was so enjoyable.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.